I'm Tony Mills, Executive Editor of Big Questions Online. In May 2017, I visited Father Thomas Joseph White, a Dominican priest and leading scholar of St. Thomas Aquinas, the famous 13th century Dominican philosopher and theologian. Father Thomas Joseph lives and teaches at the Dominican House of Studies in Washington, D.C., across the street from the National Basilica in the Catholic University of America. The topic of our conversation was whether the human person is naturally religious. That is, whether the religious impulse springs from human nature or is something that comes to us from without, from God or, perhaps, from society. According to Father Thomas Joseph, this question has more than academic interest. How we answer it will influence how we understand and participate in religious and political life. So I'd like to focus on a question that you've thought a lot about, whether the human person is naturally religious. Why does that question matter?
The question for me mattered originally actually as a theological question. There's an old argument in Augustinian theology, even dating back to the High Middle Ages, about whether religion is, in human beings, something produced by grace, and so an effect of infused charity, the Holy Spirit making the person love God and causing them to become religious, or if it's something also on a deeper level, fundamentally irrespective of grace, a disposition of our human nature, so that we're naturally religious. And Augustinians in the Middle Ages sort of differed on this question. And it's actually strikingly very contemporary. We might think about secular people looking at a colleague of theirs who becomes religious, particularly, for example, Christian, and saying, well, they claim that it's because of faith or grace or something like that, and feeling that that might be something alien to their human nature. And the mainstream position in the High Middle Ages is actually, it is also something deeply natural to be religious. It's not simply something effected in us by a kind of alien grace acting in us that was unanticipated by our human nature, but actually we're getting in touch with something very deep in ourselves. But of course, this is a hugely contested question from across the spectrum or a band of positions. You have people who are convictedly atheists who want to explain away religious behavior as a pathology. You have people who think that the sort of normal setting of human reason is agnosticism, skepticism, and caution. And then you have people who think that it is normal or natural to be religious. And so it's just a pretty acute human question in a religiously divided culture.
You talk about the Augustinian origins of one way to answer that question, and you also mentioned this more modern view. Would it be fair to characterize the Augustinian version as the religious tendency is not natural, it's supernatural, and the modern is something like the religious tendency is not natural, it's unnatural or pathological?
That's very well said. But I think that there's two very different stimuli, intellectually, that are behind those two different stances. Though you're noting that there could be parallels, because they could both end up saying religion is not per se natural. One is, I think, the Augustinian view that you find in certain passages of Augustine's City of God. I'm thinking about Book 10, Chapter 6 on sacrifice, stemming from charity, and then later in the interpretation of him given by someone like St. Bonaventure, one of the great Franciscan doctors. I think the motivation is to say, look at, in human history, we find variegated historical patterns of religious behavior. A lot of them are problematic, actually. I mean, there's a great Augustinian and even biblical Old Testament prophet suspicion of religious behavior. And so I think that trying to analyze how is it that the human race often gets this so wrong? Why is religion such a contested and problematic behavior pattern in so many human cultures? And then how do we get it right? And they think we get it right through grace and through revelation, which sort of heal and transform a bewildered humanity from being a often religiously errant humanity into a religiously functional humanity. And I think the modern project's very different. There, it stems from either moderate enlightenment or more radical enlightenment voices who want to see religion eradicated from the public square, primarily because they think it's a dangerous influence politically, morally, and perhaps even psychologically on human persons.
So would it be fair to say that those earlier modern thinkers, for them, the religious impulse might be natural if properly contained, maybe in a political context?
And sealed off from the danger of supernatural revelation. So the great response to them is the First Vatican Council, Roman Catholic Council in the late 19th century, in the document on divine revelation, where it's argued that actually the default natural setting of intelligence is to be open to the full horizon of what's real. We should be open to the fullness of the truth as it is, and raising real religious questions is part of the natural aim of the intelligence. The intelligence can ask great questions about the religious origins and purpose of existence, but that also makes us naturally open to divine revelation. So it's not really intellectually credible to simply, from the beginning, a priori, seal off the intellect from the possibility of revelation. I know God can't give me a revelation because it would definitely do harm to my intelligence. So I need to reclaim my rational autonomy by refusing from the start any possibility of divine revelation. Only bad things can happen if we go down that road. Well, the church just says, from philosophical premises, that's not actually an enlightened rational stance. The corollary of that is, however, then you get into the question of rival claimants about divine revelation. Can we ever really know if something is coming from God? Maybe we should be agnostic and skeptical about all claims about divine revelation. There are dangers involved here. So then you get into questions of rational credibility and sort of the human being testing religious belief.
I think I'm already getting a sense for what your answer to the question is, but how would you answer the question, is the human person naturally religious? And do you see that as underlying this vision that you're laying out right now?
Well, so I'm a Dominican priest in the same religious order as Thomas Aquinas, the great 13th century philosopher and theologian, and I do find Aquinas' position on this question very satisfying and very reasonable. So Aquinas asked the question, is it natural to be religious? And he says it is, and he says it's a dimension of the virtue of justice. The virtue of justice is the virtue by which we offer to each one what is due to him or her in a kind of complicated way, because what's due to one's spouse is different than what's due to one's child or the minister of the state, what he or she owes the state versus what citizens owe the state. These are complicated relationships of justice, okay? But the deeper movement here is to see that human beings have a kind of relationship of justice with God, because God has given and is giving us our existence, sustaining us in being. And God has made us with desires for truth and for happiness that cannot find their ultimate rest except ultimately in God. So there's a way that in which we can only really live out in an ordered way what we are as rational animals if we do so as religious rational animals. So, for example, when Aquinas says, well, what is prayer? Is it a capacity of the intellect, or is it a capacity of the will, the two spiritual faculties of the human soul being the intellect and the will? He says prayer is actually a capacity of the intellect. So it sort of, for Aquinas, builds off the search for the truth. If you're looking for kind of the ultimate meaning of things, ultimate explanations, and you come to see that the world actually does only make sense metaphysically if you posit some transcendent causality, that's to say that it's rational to believe in the Creator, then that kind of rational awareness of God flowers in prayer. It's funny that C.S. Lewis, in his intellectual biography, Surprised by Joy, sort of follows this almost rationalist line of thinking. He begins to think about where his conscience comes from. He becomes aware that there must be some kind of source of moral instinct in the human being, and then he just starts praying because it's the moral thing to do. It's the reasonable thing to do intellectually. And that Aquinas sort of thinks that that's a kind of natural syndrome in us, that when we look to ultimate explanations, we start to pray. And then he thinks correspondingly, the will of every human being is fundamentally more inclined and animated by desire for happiness. So when we start to think that actually our ultimate happiness could lie in our relationship with God, without denigrating all the other sources of happiness and all our other relationships, which are important, then the will can flower in what he calls devotio, or devotion, which doesn't really mean, reading particular devotional prayers. It means turning one's heart toward the ultimate good that can really make us happy. So analogous to the way that when two people fall in love with each other, one's heart becomes devoted to the other one as a source of happiness. So in an even deeper way, although less psychologically tangible way, the will can become relative to God as the source of its deepest stability and happiness and flourishing, and become devoted to God. So Aquinas thinks it's natural to be religious as a kind of flowering of the human search for the truth about the world and a human search for happiness, flowering in aspects of prayer and devotion by which we turn ourselves towards the Creator and towards the divine, and that this is present in sort of every human culture in some way, although it can often go wrong, it can be confused, it can get frustrated, it can be neglected, but it's somewhat how a kind of inalienable capacity of the human nature that we have, that we are capable of this religious ordering of our life toward God. That's a really deep account.
And what about the supernatural element for Aquinas? Is the natural tendency, is that the whole picture, or is there more?
Yeah, well, not at all. So he thinks a couple of things. First of all, the natural orientation toward God is sometimes in us wounded by ignorance, confusion, and what he calls superstitio. Superstition being when you either worship the wrong thing or prioritize the wrong thing in your life, created goods or wrong images of God, but also when you try to serve God in the wrong ways. He gives examples of like human sacrifice, which has unfortunately occurred a great deal in the history of human religion. We could give other contemporary examples, I think, like suicide bombing, where you say there's bad ways to serve God. And so superstitio and ignorance can be ways in which the human community can be clouded. Superstition can apply also to secularism in the sense that people can wrongly prioritize as ultimate that which is not ultimate in reality. So grace has two aspects to it here for religion. One is healing, to allow us to kind of find a kind of balanced way of being religious that's humane and integrated, that allows us to accept a lot of other human goods in life, family life, artistic culture, human learning. So a religion that's not hyper defensive vis-a-vis human goods, but integrates all the human goods. And then beyond healing is also elevation. So Aquinas thinks grace doesn't destroy human nature, heals human nature, and elevates human nature. And in elevating it, what grace does is allow us to orient ourselves toward God in himself, to become friends with God by the gift of grace in our religious activity. So those things like prayer and devotion can actually be placed in the service of an immediate relationship with God, which of course Aquinas believes in the Holy Trinity, believes in the revelation given in Jesus Christ. So he thinks that a personal relationship with God known in himself through divine revelation can become the animating feature of our natural religious behavior.
So the short answer, the short Thomistic answer would be, is man naturally religious? Yes, but it's complicated. There are qualifications.
Exactly. It's complicated because without grace, human nature is often wounded, and we're unable to sometimes orient ourselves religiously clearly. And of course, then skepticism can become partly a reasonable response. When you see a lot of religious pathologies in the world, you can become quite skeptical, and it's also hard to solve these questions on one's own. Sure. But by contrast, within a tradition that's been enlivened by grace and where there's been sound reasoning and healthy religious practice, the human being can find a way to orient itself towards God and find that domain in ourselves that may be religiously curious or interested, can find a way to orient that part of ourself toward God in a balanced way and in a kind of life-giving way.
You mentioned tradition. How unique is St. Thomas Aquinas' view on this historically? You mentioned this Augustinian answer, which Aquinas takes up in some respects, disagrees in others. Was he the first person to articulate this kind of view?
There are anticipations of it, say in his teacher Albert the Great. But what happened that was unique in the 13th century was that the discovery of the Aristotelian corpus raised a whole number of questions about moral activity that had not been raised in such a kind of incisive way previously, so that they really start to ask the question, is religion a part of justice as the virtue, which is a natural virtue, or part of charity, which is a supernatural infused virtue? Is it something that follows from the gift of grace through charity, or is it something that follows from the principles of nature through justice? And so Aquinas is one of the first to give a very incisive answer on the side of the natural character of religious virtue. And then the principal scholastics after him tend to follow the same direction, so that when you find, say, 16th century Jesuits and Dominicans and Franciscans treating the question, they will typically go more down this road in early modernity and in the Baroque era. So he does sort of set an inflection that he's not alone in doing this, but he's one of the principal voices that sets a course for that interpretation.
I want to return to the contemporary setting a little bit. In thinking again about the significance of this question, why in today's modern or postmodern culture should believers or non-believers who may not be theologians or philosophers care about this question, or should they? And what kind of implications might there be?
Well, I think one fundamental truth we need to accept is that religion's not going away. There's a huge interest in the traditional religious practices of the monotheistic traditions that is present in our world. It has implications for culture and politics and philosophy and art. So part of being an engaged citizen and a cosmopolitan citizen is trying to understand the motivations of religious persons in a profound way, maybe even trying to understand them sometimes more deeply than those people understand themselves. But the other countervailing force is a deep cultural amnesia about our own theological traditions in the West and our metaphysical philosophical traditions, so that thinking about God constructively, reasonably, metaphysically, and thinking about religion with some real knowledge of scripture and theology, that has faded. It's almost evaporated. So on the one hand, we have almost no real theological and metaphysical literacy with regards to our past, and on the other hand, we have a continued real strong presence of religious fervor and interest. And that's not a good combination, because it means you're going to have a religious zeal often that's not sufficiently enlightened by tradition in the best, highest sense of that word. And on the other hand, you're going to have people who are alienated from religion who have almost no grounds with which to grapple with it or try to investigate it seriously. I think we have to be the kind of people who are able to accord goodwill to our fellow citizens who don't agree with us, and understand that there are some pretty reasonable, pretty thoughtful people who hold to very different views than ourselves. It's just not the case that human reason always declines very simplistically into one pre-formatted way of seeing the world. That doesn't mean everything's relative either, but it means that doing the work of really looking at differing viewpoints takes patience and time and an industry. So understanding something about Islam seriously takes work. So also Catholicism, or really the origins of the secular Enlightenment project, and trying to understand whether our arguments for atheism really do work or not. So there's a lot of intellectual laziness and just forgetfulness that we need to conquer. It takes 3 years to have a minimal knowledge of the American law to talk about the U.S. Constitution. That's a 200-year-old tradition, and it's about a relatively small body of intellectual information, although a very noble one with a rich history. But when you talk about the ages of that we've been engaged in questions of religion and God with very high and sophisticated philosophies and theologies, it would be normal that a person would need to acquire a certain amount of reading to be able to engage with the questions, let alone to make discernments that are definitive. So I think one of our real problems is cultural amnesia, lack of engagement with our tradition.
Many people today will say things like, I'm spiritual but not religious, or maybe I'm religious but I don't like organized religion. It seems to be a fairly common sentiment, maybe explaining a lot of the broader trends that you see in contemporary culture. How does that fit into your
I'm very
narrative?
sympathetic to that in some ways. I was myself not a religious person. I went to Brown University as a secular young man and was interested in Buddhism, and eventually got interested in Christian metaphysics. So I feel like that in a way is something I can relate to, my own discovery of Christianity. I think because of the amnesia or the lack of knowledge of the religious traditions in our own era, that the spiritual but not religious default setting is speaking to a kind of caution, but also a kind of curiosity that you see in many millennials who are not really particularly formed in a religious tradition, but maybe not dismissive and maybe somehow open to investigation. And I think that investigation just needs to be structured from within by turning to good resources. There's also the desire there to have genuinely motivated spiritual behavior rather than external customs that aren't imposed, that are merely imposed by convention. Sure. Now, actually, I think upon deeper reflection, religious conventions where we use our bodies and go through rituals are actually really helpful to us as religious animals to live out our spiritual impulses. In other words, if you're really going to be spiritual in a structured way, you need to do it through external rituals and rites that are beautiful and focused. But of course, that presupposes you could find rituals and rites that are focused, that are true. So I think part of it is a kind of skeptical but not entirely dismissive engagement with religious questions, and we need to find ways to reach people who are seekers and who are actually often people of goodwill who just don't have much information but who have maybe a lot of native intelligence. How can we present them a deeper vision, a religious vision of reality? And so I think for Aquinas that goes back into the stages of the intellect still seeking perspective. The intellect seeking perspective as a propedeutic to praying. And
meaning a way of instructing how praying might be.
Yeah, I mean, so why ought I not to do Buddhist meditation? Why ought I to pray to God the Creator? Or should I somehow meditate if God is personal and in some respect and has created the world and there's a personal mystery behind the being of the world? Those are really normal questions. So thinking about how to structure my religious impulses in terms of meditation or prayer or belief, that has to do with also discerning what I think is ultimately real and what are the ultimate purposes of human existence. But asking those questions is very fruitful. And, I think Aquinas has great answers to those questions. They're very satisfying. One thing I like about Thomism, about Thomas Aquinas' thought, is there's never any antipathy between the rational and the mystical. The mystical should not become unreasonable or irrational, but human reason in its ultimate horizons is open to mystery and to the mystical. So the kind of spiritual and mystical impulse in us is as important as the rational, critical aspect of our minds, of our understanding. And you need to hold these two things together. Sometimes I think it's nice to talk about the rational mystery. Aquinas thinks of God as a rational mystery, or a mystery that can be approached with reason. So I think that is the answer. We need to help people who are spiritual but not affiliated to see that religious commitments are not merely arbitrary, but actually can stem from deeply reasoned convictions. And that the practice of a coherent, consistent religious belief leads to a kind of growth in maturity and character. So committing to things is part of the asceticism of commitment often allows us to mature in general in life, but the asceticism of religious commitment allows us to mature in our relationship with God. So I think that's something that people can grasp, and to think about developing a relationship, a mystical and rational relationship with God through commitment in religious life, in religious behavior. That's something we need to promote.